Hello everyone, this is Karen Grace Clark, Program Manager for Gold Alumni Presentations. I'm here today with Kathleen Kendall-Tackett, and we are talking about a presentation that is coming up on January 27th online called The Neuropsychological Effects of Sleep Training and Its Impact on Breastfeeding. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Kathleen, and I'm just going to delve right in and ask you a couple questions here that are on my mind. I'm wondering, there have actually been lots of studies and discussions and blog posts and just people really talking about this whole sleep training aspect of, early parenting. And I'm wondering, why is this coming up right now?
Well, I think part of the reason is because we've had some studies that have really been fairly high profile. And so I think that that's been piquing a lot of media interest. And to be honest with you, I think one of the big issues is I think a lot of parents are just really tired. And so, this sounds like it's going to be kind of a quick fix for that. We can, solve all your problems as a parent if we can kind of deal with this issue. And so I think it's kind of appealing in that way. But the main thing is it's just these, very high profile studies have come up. And so there's just been a lot of press interest because of that.
Right, okay, yeah, and people are definitely responding because the media definitely picks up, little tidbits that, maybe even they spin in interesting ways, and then, people blog about it and they talk about it, and then it just gets a little out of control sometimes. So, but what are some of the techniques that these studies are promoting, and, how do these things actually impact breastfeeding?
Well, there's usually at least a couple of techniques that these studies kind of promote. One is, sort of like waiting longer intervals, before you go to your baby, and so letting them cry for longer and longer times. The other is called camping out, which is where you sit next to your baby in the crib, but you don't pick them up. So you're sort of there with your presence, but you're not picking them up. And so again, it's another way to sort of train them to sort of be self-soothers. Those are the kind of two techniques that people use. Unfortunately, some of the more extreme examples are ones where parents just close the door and they don't come in until morning to get the baby. But many of the things in the studies are less extreme than that, fortunately, but still involving not kind of responding to the baby. And that for me raises a big concern because the breastfeeding system is so dependent on, sort of mother and baby being in sync, mother reading the baby's cues for feeding, using the baby as the best guide for when they're hungry versus the clock. And so that is one of the things that's concerning to me, and also some of these arbitrary limits about when baby should be sleeping through the night. We know in terms of a breastfed baby, oftentimes they're still night feeding, especially if a mom has small storage capacity in her breast. There's going to be sort of a continuation of night feeding, and so to have some kind of outside authority say, okay, they should stop night feeding by 3 months, from a physiological standpoint, doesn't actually make any sense. And one of the things that you see oftentimes in these cases, especially where there's kind of an extreme application of some of these techniques, is that breastfeeding starts faltering. Because again, nighttime feeding is important for maintaining a supply for a lot of women. And so that again is a concern. You tell them, okay, be responsive during the day, but not at night. And I think the sort of long-term effect of that is you see more and more mothers sort of dropping off the breastfeeding scale and not making those goals, that all the health organizations say we should try to make, which is exclusive by 6 months, continuing to breastfeed at least for the first year. That gets harder and harder to do when you start applying these techniques.
Yeah, really, really good point there. As you're sharing some of those techniques with me, and I'm listening. So much of what parents are being told is about you must do this, you must do that. It's all about that control, and I don't know. It does sort of raise emotions in me as I'm hearing you talk about some of those things, and it is definitely things that we do respond to deeply, whether we agree, with the sleep training or not. It's definitely one of those topics that people talk about a lot. So it's definitely a very, very interesting topic. But what will healthcare professionals gain from attending this particular presentation? What are the sort of takeaways?
Well, I'm hoping what they'll gain is maybe an alternate view of some of these techniques, because oftentimes these are promoted in media, and again, like in many of the press releases, and we'll talk about them, as that these are they're not only quote not harmful, but then the authors of these studies often go to the next step and say we should feel free to recommend these techniques to parents. Well, I come actually from a little different perspective, because I come from the sort of child maltreatment, family violence field. That's the field I've done research in for the last 30 years. And the neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry folks have been kind of looking at this from a different angle. So they're not looking at it from the sleep training angle, but they're looking at it more like what happens when there is not that parental responsiveness to the baby. What happens to the baby's sort of physiological systems, and what happens when a baby is left to cry. So again, it's not saying, sleep training yes or no, but it's more like what happens when we don't have that kind of parent responsiveness. And what we're discovering from that research is some really rather disturbing things. That it's not good, for example, to let a baby cry and cry and cry, because it raises the stress hormone cortisol. That's one big thing that happens. And, we know that that's actually a very toxic state for a developing brain. And so again, like I said, sometimes we need to kind of step out and get a little bit bigger picture and see what other scientists are doing. And so much of what we're discovering in terms of like what happens with adult health is related to that first 5 years. Now, again, this is not to say, I've been to some presentations where I've heard, well, if you don't respond to your baby every time, they're going to get brain damage. I am not saying that. I say, there's a larger context, like what else is going on in that family. But I do question some of these techniques that we know from other literatures, don't seem to actually be beneficial to babies. And so again, like I said, you're putting breastfeeding at risk by implementing some of these techniques. And it also looks like there may be some potential harm. So I believe actually we need to take a more critical look at some of these, and what other kinds of things can we tell parents about how to kind of help their babies. And one of the, pamphlets we produced was called Simple Ways to Calm a Crying Baby. I mean, we put that out around the same time some of these sleep training articles were coming out and said, look, here's an alternative. There's ways that parents can learn to kind of help calm their baby in ways that are going to be beneficial to mom, beneficial to baby, and, keep that breastfeeding relationship intact. And we got a ton of traffic from that. It ended up all over social media. 18,000 hits on the, the press release set. I mean, it was just an incredible kind of outpouring of response. So again, there's other things we can tell parents besides some of these more drastic kind of techniques. And that is, I think, one of the things I kind of hope that healthcare providers will take away from this is, that there is another way. There is an alternative way to look at this. And I'm going to actually take one of the studies that really, had a lot of press, release about it, and actually just kind of go through it and discuss some of the really methodological limitations in it. There were some serious ones. And so again, it's not necessarily, it's just quote this one study, but many of these studies suffer from the same problems. And so those are the kinds of issues that, I want to just kind of address. Because again, there is another way to look at these studies. And, it does raise some caution flags for me and some concerns. And that's the things we're going to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm really, really looking forward to this. I think you really are touching on something important here when you're saying that we actually really need to look at, some of these potential psychological and physical effects on the infant. What is happening within the infant's body when we are, training this type of behavior, this type of physical response in them. And then as healthcare professionals, how can we address this with parents, and how can we give parents alternatives? Because you're right, parents are tired. We do tend to live a bit of a frantic lifestyle in this, in North America here, and I think, probably in other, countries around the world as well. And parents, they do struggle. So we do have to address these things as healthcare professionals, regardless of our own, personal philosophies of parenting, because it sounds to me like that's not what this is about at all. So anyways, I really hope that people who are listening to this interview are excited by some of the things that you're going to be talking about at this presentation. And everybody who's listening, I do invite you to join us at goldlactation.com. If you have not yet registered for our alumni presentations that are live online on January 27th, 2014, you can still do so at goldlactation.com. And if you're not available to join us live, that's perfectly okay, because we will have the recordings available for you to view until February 13th. So there's about 3 weeks to listen to the recordings if you register, and you can listen at your convenience. Kathleen, once again, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful to talk to you today.
Thank you very, very much, Karen Grace, and I'm looking forward to